In 2003, Finnish studio Remedy Entertainment was looking to move away from the more linear-styled action games that they were more well known for. Instead, they'd hoped to leave a bigger mark on the games industry by creating something truly original. Their idea was a free-roaming sandbox-styled open-world game, featuring a story influenced by the works of Stephen King and David Lynch, in particular Twin Peaks. With a clear focus on survival horror and player exploration, Remedy's new title was planned to be an ambitious cinematic experience, one which would take cinematic video games into new heights. However, after 3 years spent developing this game with very little actual progress, the team at Remedy realized that they'd need to refocus on what the core elements of their game were going to be if they'd ever hoped to actually complete it. So after some careful revision, Remedy was able to alter what they already had, transforming their game into a more streamlined experience. The result of which was a 2010 release that was met with positive praise, although sales were slow due to initially releasing the same week as Red Dead Redemption. Thankfully, in the months that followed, it gained more sales through word of mouth, and in the years that followed, it developed a cult-like following, earning itself a place in pop culture as Remedy's most peculiar title, at least until Control came out. It would even earn itself a remaster in 2021, which featured updated visuals, all the post-game DLC, and even a commentary track. An ideal purchase for anyone who's never tackled the series, especially if one intended to prepare for the sequel. So let's talk about it. This is Alan Wake Remastered. Taking place in the fictional town of Bright Falls, we follow the story of best-selling novelist Alan Wake, who has been suffering from a 2-year stretch of writer's block. So at the advice of his wife, Alice, she and Alan travel to the small town of Bright Falls for a brief vacation, with the hope that this break would be exactly what Alan needed to rekindle his passion for writing. However, it isn't long after his arrival in town that things start to go wrong. From the moment the sun goes down, Alan starts suffering from vivid hallucinations, whilst his perception of reality gradually becomes more distorted as he's assaulted by shadowy figures that resemble the locals. Amidst all this newfound chaos, Alan's wife goes missing. To make matters worse, after her disappearance, Alan's perception of time skips forward an entire week, leaving him with significant gaps in his own memory and a lack of understanding as to how he ended up in this exact situation, which all culminates in the discovery that the island which he and his wife Alice had been staying at on Cauldron Lake has seemingly vanished without a trace, leaving Alan with nothing to prove his story, just a lot of unanswered questions and a newfound fear of the dark. So left with no other option, Alan Wake gets to work unraveling this tangled web of mysteries and convoluted literary tropes, all the while having to contend with hordes of shadow monsters, sentient objects, and birds. So many birds. The game's story is set up like a traditional mystery show, with every episode gradually revealing new details about the game's world and its characters. With 6 episodes in its base game and 2 DLC episodes set after the events of the main storyline, naturally there's going to be a lot of ground to cover, especially since the story is constantly jumping locations and introducing new plot elements with every episode, from new characters to story revelations and even major plot twists. As the game goes along, you might start finding it hard to keep track of everything. God knows I did. When I first started playing Alan Wake, I genuinely thought the story was an incoherent mess that didn't make a lick of sense. Yet as it went along and the pieces started to fall into place, I began to see the true brilliance of this batshit insane narrative. In essence, Alan Wake is basically what happened if you took all the most common tropes found in mystery and horror-based fiction, threw them into a blender, and then proceeded to dump them all over your game's world. It sounds absurd, and it shouldn't work, and yet somehow Remedy makes it work. One moment, Alan will be dealing with a straightforward kidnapping, only to suddenly start being chased by the police, which then somehow leads into him being captured by a creepy psychiatrist. This all happens while Alan is constantly having to contend with the Dark Presence, a malevolent force hell-bent on reshaping the world to its liking. So calling this game odd would be quite the understatement. I'm pretty confident in saying that if this game had been written by anyone else, it likely would have fallen apart before the halfway point. But Remedy took care to give both the player and the characters in this world the time they needed to process the events in this story. That said, if you're assuming that things will start to tone down after the first few episodes, you're gonna be in for one hell of a surprise, cause like any big mystery show, the danger will only become more intense as the story goes along.
Mr. Wake? Oh, hell. It happened just the way it was on that page. I found. Came true. It knew. So dark. It'll come back for me. You must... The lights. In the office. I have the key.
Okay, Rusty. Hang on. I'll be right back.
As for the characters themselves, they're a bit of a mixed bag. Matthew Peretta does a good job at serving as both the game's narrator and the title character, perfectly capturing Alan's speculative mindset. He really feels like an ordinary man caught in an unescapable nightmare, one who loves to draw attention to the more subtle details of the world, while at the same time perplexed at everything that's around him. As for the supporting cast, they mostly consist of a group of overly generic archetypes, each of whom handle their respective roles quite appropriately. From the loyal best friend to the savvy cop and even the unorthodox secret agent, everyone adheres to the narrative which has been laid out before them, making one wonder exactly how much of their respective personalities and actions are genuine and not a byproduct of the supernatural force which has taken hold of this town. In essence, this is the kind of story that rewards the more attentive players. If you go into this game completely blind like I did, then you'll definitely end up scratching your head in confusion at every new revelation. There are plenty of moments throughout where the developers will simply let you take in your environment before forcing you back into the nightmare. But if you're paying enough attention to the story or possess enough awareness of certain literary tropes, then you can easily figure out where the game's plot is going to take you. As a horror game, it manages to feature both the frantic pace of a more action-packed title, whilst also being able to slow down and let the game's atmosphere speak for itself. Frankly, it's really hard to talk about this game's story without spoiling it, and personally, I really don't want to. This game has the kind of story that's best experienced for yourself. It's the same reason why I'm not going to go into detail about the DLC episodes, since those take place following the events of the main story. All I will say is this: if you've ever wondered what it's like being trapped within the creative process of a writer, then this is the game for you.
Hey! Hey, you! Phil! There's been an accident. I need help. Listen, I need to...
Premium cabins for rent in...
Oh, hell.
Carl Stuckey. Pleased to meet you. Non-refundable reservation deposit required.
However, while the story is a well-constructed puzzle that delves deep into the psyche of a man, the gameplay leaves much to be desired, especially for a 10-hour campaign filled to the brim with collectibles to find and monsters to fight. For starters, the combat is pretty bare in terms of mechanics, which is frankly quite bizarre considering how unique the setup for this game is. You'd think Remedy would do more with the idea of fighting a monster capable of warping reality, but when you actually stop to think about the design of the combat itself, it basically follows all the same tropes of a traditional third-person horror game. In terms of weaponry, you mostly have generic stuff like revolvers, shotguns, and hunting rifles. They all function as you'd expect them to, and there's no way for you to improve their capabilities in-game. So where the combat starts to get more complex is in regards to your flashlight and the importance of light in a world shrouded by darkness. The enemies in this game, who are referred to as the Taken, are all protected by a shield of darkness, initially rendering them impervious to attack. As such, they can only be hurt after enough exposure to light, which gradually burns the darkness away and destroys their shield. However, much like your weapons have limited ammo, your flashlights have a limited battery life. Therefore, if you run low on power, you'll have to choose between inserting fresh batteries into the flashlight or waiting for the power to recharge. Although unlike swapping batteries, recharging will take time and leave you vulnerable to attack as you wait. As such, in order to be successful in combat, you need to learn to balance out your two main resource pools: ammo for your guns and batteries for your flashlight, both of which will need to be restocked if you run low, and resources are scarce to say the least. Furthermore, since the darkness's strength can vary among the Taken, you'll need to be careful with who you waste your power on. Do you prioritize killing the larger enemies over the small ones, or focus on the weaker enemies first before dealing with the largest threat in the area? These are questions you'll have to ask yourself constantly and quickly, especially since you'll rarely find yourself in a situation where you'll be able to deal with enemies slowly. That said, your flashlight isn't the only source of light in this game. The developers also included environmental-based light sources, which are commonly situated in the larger combat encounters. These fixed sources of light are an effective way at thinning out large hordes and making even the most chaotic combat encounters more manageable. But easily the best and most readily source of light in the game comes from the numerous light-based weapons you can find, from your trusty flare gun to handheld flares and even flashbangs. While these weapons might not be the best suited to killing zombies or demons, they're perfectly designed to wipe out hordes of Taken. In this game, nothing can provide you with more relief than staring down a group of shadow monsters only to kill them all with one well-placed flare. Of course, like any horror game, this relief is only temporary. Eventually, the power you hold over your enemies will be replaced with terror, whether it be due to a lack of resources or simply their overwhelming numbers. It's bound to happen sooner rather than later. It's during moments like these that it'll be in your best interest to find a safe haven. So as you progress throughout each episode, you'll want to keep an eye out for any large sources of light, more often in the form of a street lamp. These serve as your in-game checkpoints, providing you with a temporary safe haven and allowing Alan to regain his health faster. Without them, your health will only regenerate at a much slower pace. Furthermore, the added benefit of finding a checkpoint is that all enemies within your local vicinity disappear. A welcome relief when you've been running from hordes of Taken and have no weapons on hand. Something which will happen, I can assure you. That said, not every checkpoint is readily available. Some actually break once you use them, while others require you to activate a generator before they can be used. These moments certainly add an extra layer of tension to an already tense horror game. But aside from the checkpoints, there's not really any other moments in this game where you'll truly feel safe. Naturally, darkness is the enemy, so it's only during the daytime that you can be assured that nothing will attack you. Even then, these daylight segments are short and only serve to progress the story. So with the exception of natural and manufactured light, the only time you'll ever feel safe or empowered at night is whenever you're driving a car. Sure, the controls might be a bit clunky, but at least you won't have to worry about any Taken sneaking up on you. Instead, you get to be the overwhelming threat for a change, all the while protected by a metal shell as you run your enemies over. These brief moments when you're in a vehicle are a welcome change from being on foot. They give the player some much needed power in a game where it's so frequently robbed from you. Like any good video game villain, the Taken are both relentless and diverse. Some of them wield axes and knives, while others use shovels and chainsaws. Some are capable of throwing their weapons at you from a distance, while others can charge headfirst into you like a speeding truck. Later on in the game, you'll even encounter Taken that are capable of teleporting. Those ones are especially challenging to deal with. Once they have their eyes set on you, they won't stop until you're dead. Finally, to add some extra flair, you'll sometimes have to combat flocks of possessed ravens or even animated objects. These can be a real pain to deal with, especially since they take full advantage of the game's physics engine to pummel you to death. Never in my life did I think I'd be minding my own business, only to suddenly get attacked by a possessed bulldozer. Remedy certainly knows how to make some unique combat encounters. That said, while on paper there is a good variety of enemies to deal with across this lengthy campaign, the issues come from the fact that there's not many ways for you to actually tackle the combat. Sure, the shield mechanic does add some much needed complexity, but as a result of its inclusion, all the combat encounters basically boil down to the same basic setup. Weaken an enemy's shield and then shoot them once it's down. That's it. There's no other way for you to approach the combat in this game. While other horror games have learned that it's best to keep the gameplay fresh by providing the player some new weapons, environmental challenges, or unique enemies to fight, here you're basically dealing with the same combat encounters against the same types of enemies across an entire playthrough with no way to actually alter or improve your chances in combat. This can make the gameplay quite tedious, especially on the harder difficulties where your enemy's shields will take even longer to be destroyed. Sure, there are some moments where you can take advantage of your environment in combat, but these instances are quite rare and don't happen often enough to be a viable strategy across the whole campaign. It certainly doesn't help that all your gear is frequently taken from you at the end of every episode, effectively resetting any progress you might have made and improving your chances at surviving the next combat encounter. There are occasions where I thought I could avoid combat altogether by just running away, but Alan's running speed is basically the equivalent of a slow jog, which does make some sense. Alan is a rider, so he probably doesn't exercise a lot. However, this simply means that running from combat is pointless, since anytime you try, your enemies will be able to catch up to you just as quickly. That said, Alan can perform a slow motion cinematic dodge whenever an enemy's attack is about to land, but this doesn't help when you're getting attacked by multiple enemies at once. Too often you'll get overwhelmed, making it hard to effectively avoid taking damage. So in most cases, your only options are to fight or to evade enemies with your flashlight, which need I remind you has limited power, meaning that if you don't have any bullets on you, all you're really doing is delaying your execution. It's frustrating, since you can clearly tell that the developers put a lot of work into this game's design. Every episode features some impressively large environments for the player to explore, and you're often encouraged to do so. However, yet again, Remedy didn't really do much with these environments to help them stand out. Aside from hiding collectibles and additional resources, most of the time you're just running around an empty sandbox with nothing in between key locations. Sure, there are sometimes puzzles to complete, but what few puzzles there are usually consist of you moving some large object to somewhere else so you can climb it. Furthermore, despite the open openness of this game's design, it's actually quite linear and restrictive. Each episode only really has one route you can take throughout each level, with no alternate pathways to reach the next objective. Which, while that would be an ideal feeling to evoke for a horror game, it's more likely that this was simply a byproduct of Remedy using already finished assets when restructuring the development for this game, rather than it being deliberate by design. Thinking about it now, I imagine this lack of variety in the gameplay was a byproduct of Remedy restructuring the development of their game. You can clearly tell they wanted their game world to be more open, but they failed to consider how their shift in design would affect the overall gameplay loop. After all, what makes an ideal action horror game isn't simply the challenging combat, but rather all the various methods the player is given to tackle the in-game threats, whether by giving you the tools to set up traps and distractions, allowing you to confront the horror with a vast array of weaponry, or by simply giving you the option to avoid combat altogether. There's nothing wrong with having your protagonist be ill-equipped to deal with the horrors in their world. In fact, it's a pretty common trope in this genre, but it has been done better than Alan Wake. The fact is, this game sets itself up as a survival horror game, when in reality it's leaning more towards action horror, which wouldn't be an issue if they'd simply refined the gameplay to match this type of genre. But since they didn't, the combat feels far too tedious and repetitive to be considered good, which is a damn shame. With such a good story, I'd hope that the gameplay would meet the same level of quality, but as it is now, it leaves much to be desired. Still, even if the gameplay couldn't deliver, I'm happy to report that Alan Wake has a fantastic soundtrack, one which can leave you with an inescapable sense of dread at any given moment, while also paving the way for some of the most bombastic action set pieces ever to be found in a horror game. Composed by Petri Alanko and featuring Finnish rock band The Poets of the Fall, Alan Wake's soundtrack is best described as haunting yet absurdly fun. Not quite what you'd imagine from a horror game, but this is where Remedy's eccentric nature comes into play. Where any other developer would just stick with making their soundtrack as terrifying as humanly possible, Remedy went the extra mile to remind the player of the inherent beauty and joy to be found in an otherwise dark world, while at the same time leaving some room for some good old-fashioned rock and roll. At any moment, the music could chill you to your bones and leave you with an inescapable sense of dread, only to warm your body to the core as if the sunlight was enveloping you in a tender hug. It's this mixture of different tones and styles that not only serves to make the soundtrack stand out, but provided with the necessary character needed for a story like this, one which effectively showcases the darkness within us all, yet also reminds you of everyone's inherent goodness. That said, in a game this dark, there will be many moments where you can barely see what's around you, times where the soundtrack will gradually quiet down and become more of a somber melody. It's here during these moments where the game's sound design takes center stage, and my god did Remedy nail the twisted nature of Alan Wake's world in that regard. When you're dealing with a narrative defined by the ability to alter reality however you wish, where you'll often have to rely solely on the sounds in your environment to guide you through the darkness, having a solid blend of natural and unnatural sounds is imperative. In essence, you need the character's world to remain firmly anchored in reality, while at the same time showing it progressively becoming more twisted as the plot progresses. By doing this, the developers would be able to convey the horror of a normal world slowly being transformed into something completely unrecognizable. This is best demonstrated through the Taken and the way they talk in-game. Through their dialogue, the game perfectly illustrates how the dark place slowly strips away any individuality a person has, transforming clear and concise taunting from an unwilling enemy into nonsensical babbling that belongs in a madhouse. This gradual change to the enemy's speech goes a long way to remind you that you're not just fighting against shadowy monsters in this game, but that you're dealing with real people that are being taken advantage of, which in turn allows the developers to further emphasize the stark difference between the mundane waking world and the more fantastical yet confusing nightmare that awaits whenever night falls. A sentiment which has been shared by both the game's sound design and its visuals. Whenever it comes to remasters, my biggest concern is that in updating a game for a new generation of consoles, that the developers would lose much of the mystique and atmosphere present in the original game's visuals. But thankfully, that isn't the case here. Since Remedy chose to forego updating their game's engine, it allowed them to focus more on refining and adjusting their already existing assets to fit new hardware, resulting in a visual style that still feels familiar to longtime fans, whilst also providing the player with more clarity than what was present in the original game. With a steady 30 to 60 frames per second, Alan Wake's first trek through Bright Falls has never looked this good. All the while, the developers are able to maintain the dark and oppressive atmosphere of the original game, one which fills you with dread whenever you walk into the shadows, and actively encourages you to seek out the nearest light source for safety. Of course, while the game's aura has remained unchanged, the developers have taken the time to make some slight adjustments to the visuals to allow for a more consistent experience overall, the biggest of which being the character models. The remaster has clearly had a lot of focus put into improving the character models, with Adam especially being given extra care so he more closely resembles the actor who portrays him. But then there's also small things like altering the water textures so they now utilize 3D motion, or how about completely remaking certain cutscenes with motion capture, allowing for a more nuanced and fluid performance from the characters. But that's not all. Along with the graphics, the UI has also received a slight overhaul. It's not as noticeable as some of the other changes to the game, but it is a necessary change all the same. Since the game's resolution was increased for the remaster, the HUD had to be redone in order to ensure everything was still readable. This isn't the only subtle change the developers have made to the game. They've also taken the time to remove the product placement and update the game's text fonts. Not only that, but they also include new Easter eggs that directly reference the game's sequel, all of which was done without having to compromise the original game's vision. Safe to say, these changes and new additions go a long way to elevate an already unique experience even further.
This is good work for a night person.
This was certainly an interesting game to play. Would I consider Alan Wake to be the perfect survival horror game? No, not really. I can think of a number of different games which pull off survival horror better than this one. However, is it an unforgettable cinematic experience? Most definitely. I can't recall the last time I was left so dumbfounded by a video game. From its premise to the gameplay and even the way its characters evolve alongside the story, Alan Wake quickly proves to be quite memorable. Sure, the combat can range from simple to downright frustrating at a moment's notice, but when you have a story this engaging, an atmosphere that permeates throughout every inch of this game's design, and a soundtrack that leaves you on the edge of your seat, how can you not get suckered into this game? With the remaster going the extra mile to update the visuals for current gen consoles, now is the best time to revisit this classic from Remedy Entertainment. This is the kind of game that'll make you fear the dark and question the very nature of storytelling, whilst also leaving you guessing as to what these developers might think of next. Seriously, if you think this game is weird, oh boy, you're in for one hell of a ride.